streaming today's presentation on your internet devices. We also express gratitude to the Resident Executive Council for their year-long support of Convocations. Just a word about the choice of today's hymn, number 765 in your hymnal, the Glory to God hymnal. It's a song of hope, which Rebecca Thompson introduced to us in her instructive hymn sings. Learning of the experiences and efforts of today's speaker, Dr. David Domke, and his challenge for action should inspire hope in us to act as part of God's continuing creation. Seated, we'll sing this Argentinian folk melody twice. With those of you who'd like to sing the second stanza in Spanish, please feel free to do so. And thanks to Judy Ballinger for accompanying us today, and to Jeannie Cobb for leading us with her splendid voice. So if you'll please turn to 765.
Ready? Here we go. May the God of hope go with us every day, filling our lives with love and joy and peace. May the God of justice speed us on our way, bringing light and hope to every land and race. Praying, let us work for peace. Singing, share our joy with all. Working for a world that's new. Faithful when we hear Christ's call. Dios de la esperanza, demos gozo, paz. Al mundo en crisis habla de verdad. Dios de la justicia, dándonos tu luz. Luz y esperanza en la oscuridad. Oremos por la paz. Cantemos de tu amor. Luchemos por la paz, fieles a ti, Señor. Way to go.
Thank you, Jeannie. The scripture reading today is from Romans 5, 1 through 2. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Through him we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand, and we rejoice in our hope of sharing the glory of God. Let us pray together. Creator God, we're grateful for your grace in which we stand, and for the opportunity to learn about and from the experiences of another who has gone where we may not have been, but has the gift of communicating what is of value for us to know. May this time together be a blessing to those who speak and to those who listen. In your name, amen. I'm certain it's not news to anyone here that we are in a national election year. What is not certain, to me anyway, is what steps may I, can I, should I take to participate in this election process prior to filling out my own ballot. David, it's my great hope that by listening to you today, I'll gain a clearer idea of ways I might encourage and aid others to exercise their constitutional right to vote in 2024. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. David Domke to our community, a community in which there are many who have fought front and center for civil and political rights in many different times, places, and circumstances. David Domke worked as a journalist for several newspapers in the 80s and 90s before earning his PhD in 1996. He served as a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Washington until he retired in 2021. I have a grandson who's a graduate of that university. His research focused on communication, politics, and public opinion in the United States. In 2002, he received the University of Washington's Distinguished Teaching Award. In 2006, he was named the Washington State Professor of the Year by the Council for Advancement and Support of Education and the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. At Common Power, he supports the staff through raising funds, teaching about voting rights, and providing political analysis and strategy. His presentation today will explore the fight for the right to vote and American democracy in 2024. Thank you for being with us today, David. Even though you are still in Washington, we hope our internet connection will be in our favor, and we appreciate you sharing your story with us and the story of those with whom you engage. Thank you, David.
Thank you so much. Barbara, is that you? We haven't had the chance to meet in person, so I just don't know. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Really glad to be with you all, an honor to be here. I'm in my office, my home office in Seattle, Washington, about 1.5 miles, 2 miles from the University of Washington, where I was fortunate to be on the faculty for 23 years. Studying and teaching about analyzing American politics, how it is that we live, struggle, and attempt to be a multiracial democracy. It is hard enough to be a democracy anywhere at any time in the world's history. To be a multiracial democracy is a unique attempt and challenge for the United States. And it is forever and always under assault and under attack. And that's where we are right now. I want to talk about voting rights, what we call at Common Power voting justice. And I'm part of an organization called Common Power that has many different facets to it. I will end my talk today with a little bit of an overview of that organization. And today I come to you from one domain of the organization, which is called our Institute for Common Power, which is focused and offers programming about civil rights, voting rights, racial justice in America, and has programming from a whole lot of scholars and teachers. It's a remarkable endeavor that we're thrilled to offer, and it's 99% online. So if there's things that you see of interest here in this presentation, and you want to know more about the Institute for Common Power, or to take in some of our offerings online, you can do that. Zoom makes that very possible. So thank you all for coming and for the work you've done. It's clear that you care about our democracy and that you're committed to it. I'm going to talk today about the fight right now for voting rights in America. Historically, we can go back to the beginning of the United States, and voting rights were extended only to white men who usually owned property in this country. Voting rights were also left up to the states to decide upon who should have them, who should not have them, and what it entails to get them, because the states had very differing notions of property and citizenship, and so they just couldn't reach any kind of consensus, so the notion of who could vote was left entirely to the states. That's the way it was when the country started. Over time, there have been a series of constitutional amendments that have been added to the United States Constitution, and then some laws that have been passed by the Congress that have built voting rights, or what we call voting justice, into the American electorate. Some of those are really, really, really important, and some of them today aren't as utilized or have even been struck down by the Supreme Court in ever, and certainly the robbers court that we exist under right now. So the fight for voting justice today is very much visceral. It's happening right now before our very eyes. And it's been a long, slow decline since the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. The 65 Voting Rights Act, which was a bipartisan endeavor. In fact, Republicans are very quick to note that there were more Republican votes for the Voting Rights Act in Congress in 1965 than there were Democratic votes. That is factually correct. Because at that time, the party that and the voters in Congress who opposed voting rights for African Americans and other communities of color were white Southern Democrats. So white Southern Democrats overwhelmingly opposed the Voting Rights Act. That wonderful bipartisan act in 1965 has been slowly chipped away and then more vigorously under legal assault over the last 6 decades. We're approaching our 60th year of anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. I'm not going to go through all that history. There's an enormous amount there, and I do commend the kind of content we offer at the Institute, because we do go into that history and we do learn about who did what and when and why and what it means for today. But I'm going to pick it up right now where we are, okay? Going to look at it distinctly this moment, this fight for democracy. And it's pretty common when I talk to civic groups or political organizations of whatever age, of whatever racial background, that they are inspired by a particular vision of how justice happens in this world that Dr. Martin Luther King offered. And you're familiar with the famous phrase that Dr. King often declared in the 1960s, when he said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." And this is a very powerful claim, and is also for those of us that believe that we have not achieved sufficient equality and opportunity and liberty and justices in America. It's very comforting. It's encouraging, it's comforting, helps us to believe and to be confident that is, even in difficult moments and when times seem to be going backwards, in terms of the rights and the justice that's available to people, that we can still believe and hope that eventually the arc of the moral universe is going to bend towards justice. So when I hear this phrase, this sentence, I think of an arch, what an arc looks like when it's put into completion, an arch. And the arc goes up and is rounded and comes down. I mean, we, of course, have that kind of visual image, and we see that in our public buildings all the way back in human history. The way that arches have an arc to them and have strength built on both sides. There's a rise, and then there's a kind of another side to it where hopefully we're in a better place than when we started. So when we think about this quote, I guess I always have the question, or I should say for the last 20 years or so in my life, I've had the question, is it really occur? Does the arc of the moral universe really bend towards justice? And if it does occur, how does it occur exactly? How does it happen? All right? Does the arc of the moral universe really bend toward justice? And so if it does, then the mental image I have is this kind of nice arc that just traces what an arch looks like, and it rises and then it bends nicely somehow towards justice, and then drives towards justice. And that's what I'd like to believe. That's what the quote suggests. But I don't think it really happens that way. And the more that I have grown, and the more that I have moved from theoretically thinking about justice and the universe to the actual down in the weeds engagement of the fight for democracy and for what we call voting justice at this organization, Common Power, the more I've concluded that it doesn't look nice and simple like this. It doesn't occur in a nice rounded way, and it certainly doesn't bend easily. Actually, I think the arc of the moral universe looks more kind of like this as an endeavor. You can see on the left side, we're starting up the arc and we're climbing, and then something knocks us sideways. Some things come along and knock us sideways. Things don't unfold the way we want. Well, then we get back up again and we start to climb, and then boom, we're knocked backwards again, and then we pick ourselves, if we're lucky, up again, and we keep climbing. That in reality, human history tells us that the arc of the moral universe for anybody fighting for justice is not a nice rounded affair that bends towards justice on its own. Actually, it's jagged, it's rough, it's difficult, and it doesn't easily bend. The quote itself also doesn't seem to imply that there's anybody who's trying to block the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice. And in reality, there are lots of people that are trying to block the arc of the universe bending towards justice. So I think it's really important when we think about the arc of the moral universe to identify and to recognize and to visually place into our minds the fact that there are counter forces and distinct people that are attempting to block that. Obvious examples would be someone like an Adolf Hitler, okay? But it's not just those dramatic examples, it's also others in a daily existence, socially, politically, culturally, who are trying to block that arc. They think that they're doing the right thing. I assume that's what they think, but they are distinctly fighting against the moral universe bending towards justice. So to me, this is actually the more accurate representation of how one goes about trying to bend the arc of the moral universe. It's difficult, it's challenging, it doesn't go the way you want, it's not a nice arc, and you are fighting against distinct entities all the time. This is what the truth and the reality of it all is. So I think if I was going to try to phrase what Dr. King is saying in a more learned, from myself, learned perspective, one that I've learned over time and kind of come to conclude, I might say it this way. I might say that the arc of the moral universe is long, jagged, brutally contested, and unguaranteed. But we worked to bend it because of our commitment to a more just world and to one another, past, present, and future. That's a representation of the arc of the moral universe that, to me, captures what I've seen people like the ones over my shoulder and the work that they've done. Over here we have the great John Lewis, and over here we have a collection of people who were the Freedom Riders in 1961, who sought to force the United States government to uphold a Supreme Court decision that had said that segregated interstate bus travel was unconstitutional. But the court wouldn't do anything to hold it up, so those Freedom Riders of different racial backgrounds got on buses and forced the hand of the government. These are my heroes. There are some of them, the great John Lewis and the great Freedom Riders, because they took action. They moved from a position and a perspective to actual action. And when you go over the bridge, and I'm going to end this slide here, but when you go over the bridge in Selma, Alabama, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named for a Confederate war general who was a slaveholder, and you go across that bridge as the protesters working for voting justice in 1965 were attempting to do on a 54-mile march from Selma to the state capitol in Montgomery, and when they were badly beaten on what became known as Bloody Sunday. Today, when you go over that bridge in Selma, which I've had the privilege to do several times with people committed to this work, and you get to the other side of the bridge, there are a whole bunch of monuments, and one of them is for John Lewis. And all of the monuments have quotes on them, the words of the people that they're honoring. And the quote on John Lewis's monument says this. It's something he used to say to his fellow colleagues all the time in the movement in the 1960s. It's this. When we pray, we must move our feet. And that's the mentality of John Lewis. At the end of conversations, John Lewis would say, I understand where we all come down on this, but for me, I am going to march. We must move our feet, folks. We must. If we don't go across that bridge, we don't get the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And if we don't do what we at Common Power today say, we call investing time and treasure today, then we're not going to have a democracy in the way that we understand it today. We're not going to have it tomorrow. And we are 6 months from that tomorrow, right now. I don't consider my claims or my statements in this address, this lecture, to be partisan. I will be saying things that sound partisan, but they are factually grounded statements that simply have partisan outcomes to them. And the reality is that one political party in this country wants us to vote, and one does not want everyone to vote. They only want certain people in certain ways to vote. I'm committed to everybody. That's what voting justice is in a democracy, everybody. The trajectories today are that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are going in divergent ways, like they're going in divergent ways in the fight for democracy, in their approaches to democracy. And I always want, when I give talks, to be suggestive of books that people might want to read on your own. These are books that I have learned a lot from, that inform my understanding, have been part of my journey. My bookshelves over here are next to the kind of collection of desk materials I have over here is book after book about voting rights, about the fight for civil rights and racial justice in this country. This book by Ari Berman, who writes for The Nation, is called Give Us the Ballot. It takes a phrase that Dr. King used to utilize, and the subtitle is The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. It's a great book, talks about the fight really from the Voting Rights Act, from the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to today. This is another great book by Dr. Carol Anderson, One Person, No Vote. The title itself is a slight rejiggering of a famous Supreme Court statement. The Supreme Court statement in the 1960s was one man, one vote. That everybody should have a vote, and the vote should be equivalent from one person to the next. Today, Carol Anderson says it's not that way. It's one person and no vote for too many people, particularly communities of color in the United States. And her subtitle is How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. I highly recommend both of these books. They are not only compelling and darn informative, they're also easy to read and make sense of. They're written for people like myself to understand the world. Here's a third book I want to mention. Called Laboratories Against Democracy. When you look at the cover of the title, written by this professor, Dr. Jacob Grumbach, who's a professor at UC Berkeley. was a professor at the University of Washington for a period of time and recently has moved to Berkeley. When you look at the title of the book, it looks like there's been the word against placed over some other word, and that's intentional. What it's supposedly referring to is laboratories of democracy. And that is a phrase that has often been used by people to refer to state governments, that they can be laboratories of democracy as we try to figure out how to live out this national multiracial democracy, that state governments can be these wonderful laboratories for figuring things out. He's arguing in the book that states have become the place actually where people are figuring out how to block democracy, and then they're taking that wisdom to the national level. And so his subtitle is How National Parties Transformed State Politics, made states turn into the laboratories against democracy, and then they circle back and inform national party strategies. Grumbach's book is a great book. It's a 2021 publication. All of these books are in the last decade. They all focus on slightly different dimensions of our democracy. I want to take Grumbach's book and dive into a certain dimension of it that is very informative to us as we think about the two trajectories of these political parties today and what they might do coming out of the 2024 election, depending on who gains power in this election. So I'm going to focus on Grumbach's book. All three of them, though, I highly recommend. Grumbach, in his book, has something that he creates called the State Democracy Index. The State Democracy Index is an idea that he creates, and it's to create a measurement of just how small d democratic a state might be. And he has over 50 indicators of what might make democracy happen. And I don't expect you to be able to read those. I can't really read them either. I just wanted to show them all in one visual image. These are 50 plus what he calls variables, different things you can measure as indicators of how small d democratic a state might be. And it's got a whole bunch of different things that you could take into consideration. I'm going to simplify this into 6 categories that Grumbach focuses on in that 50 plus set of measurements. And I want to identify those 6 and then dive into those a bit as we examine what's going on in states around the country and how does that inform what national parties are doing and might do for power, whoever comes out of the 2024 election with power. The first kind of category of these 50 plus measurements is voter registration ease. How easy is it to register to vote in a state? What are the dimensions that might make it easier to vote or harder to vote? Well, who can register voters in a state? A state that allows anyone to register voters is an easier voter registration state than states that require you to be licensed to register voters. In the state of Texas, for example, you have to be licensed by county commissioners in order to be able to register voters. You have to have gone through a class, you have to be licensed, you have to also live within that district. It is illegal in the state of Texas to be an unlicensed voter registrar and to be unlicensed and to register voters. They want to make it be that only people in the county who've gone through a licensing process can register to vote. Now, maybe that's defensible. I don't know. It's certainly, though, harder to register to vote than it is in the state of Washington or the state of California, where there are no limitations on who can register people to vote. The voter still has to fill out the form and complete it, but anybody can make it happen. So how easy is it to register to vote? Some states allow online registration. That's easier than states that don't allow online registration. Some states make it the case that only a voter registered can touch their form, literally physically touch their form and turn it in. Nobody else can touch it and turn it in. So those that allow other states to touch it, that's easier to register to vote in that state. So a state that's higher on the ease of registering to vote is considered a more small d democratic state. They're going to score higher on a state democracy index if it's easier to register to vote, because this opens up the playing field for more people. The next category is voting method. What are the ways that you can vote? You all live, or at least I think all of you do, or at least, or I think all or most, in the state of California. California, like the state of Washington, where I live, is a mail voting state. California is transitioning to that right now, but people are voting by mail. In the state of Washington, everyone votes by mail unless you choose to go vote in person. You can do that at county voting stations, but virtually everybody else votes by mail. So what are the different ways you can vote? You can vote in person in a polling location. You could vote the day of an election. You could vote in person days before an election in some states. You can vote by mail, all right? There are a lot of different ways that you could possibly vote. If you vote by absentee, that means you say, I can't be in the state to vote at the time of the election. I'd like to be able to vote on my own time. Some states allow you to do this without any reason for it. You just can say you want to do it. Other states are very, very strict in what reasons you can give for saying that you want to vote by absentee. So let's understand that there are a bunch of different ways that somebody can vote in the country today. States that offer more methods to vote, offer more opportunities, make it easier for people to vote. So a state that has more voting methods is going to be higher on a state democracy index than a state that offers fewer. As an example, the state of Alabama is a state where you can only vote the day of the election, except for very few absentee ballots. They have very strict reasons for how you can get an absentee ballot, so that everybody has to vote the day of the election. And if you do vote absentee, you have to sign a couple different forms and affidavits and provide certain ID in order to be able to vote absentee. So they really get almost everybody voting in person on the day of the election, and their voting window is from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. That's it. So that's not high on the index. That's very, very low on the state democracy index for that measure of voting methods. The next category is election security. How much care does a state take in making sure that someone's vote is accurately tallied and is the person themselves who say they're going to vote? States that do more about this, that have, for example, a paper trail for voting, so that when you push electronically, if you vote electronically, that there's a printed out ballot that matches your name. Or in the state of Washington, I get to tear off a strip that is my ballot piece, that when I mail in my ballot, I can check and see if my ballot has been received and counted. And is there a check on signatures? Yes, there's a check to make sure my signature matches the one that is on file for me. So states that are better at keeping track of ballots, making sure all votes are counted, no votes get just subjectively thrown out, is higher in election security. So a state that is higher and is better about this and does more of these things is higher on the state democracy index than a state that doesn't. And disfranchisement is the concept that examines whether somebody who is convicted of a felony, how easily do they get the right to vote back? In the United States, 48 out of 50 states in the country have a felon disfranchisement law of some kind, which says that you lose the right to vote when you're convicted of a felony. Only 2 states don't, the state of Vermont and the state of Maine. The other 48 have some felon disfranchisement. On the state democracy index that Grumbach builds, he looks at how difficult is it to get the right to vote back. What kind of hoops you have to jump through, what kind of fees you have to pay, how much legal representation do you have to have, how quickly do you get it back? Do you get it back the day you come out of prison? Do you get it back only after parole and probation? In a nutshell, states that make it harder to get your right to vote back after felon disfranchisement are lower on the index than states that make it easier. to get your right to vote back. I personally think that in the United States, no one should ever lose the right to vote as a citizen of the United States. That even when you're convicted of a felony, even the grossest, most terrible felony, the worst, the murders, the rapes, the assault, all of those, you should still have the right to vote because you're still a citizen and you contribute economically based upon what you do in prison to the society. You're still a citizen in the society. I personally think that. That's what would be called an absolutist voting position. Now, I totally recognize, though, that others have positions that say, you know, if you can get convicted of felonies, certainly the worst felonies, you should lose the right to vote, at least while you're in prison, at least. Okay, all right, fine. I can buy that, too. It's not my position, but I can accept that. But the issue becomes how easily can you get it back afterwards, because it's such an important part of being a citizen. If you are in a state where it's easier to get the right to vote back after felon disfranchisement, then you're higher on the state democracy index. Two more subcategories. Voter ID laws. In 35 states in this country, there are laws that require you to show some form of identification when you not only register to vote, but also when you go to vote. And on its face, this seems totally reasonable. If you have to show an ID to buy certain medications, then it seems like you should have to show an ID to vote. And I've been totally good with this, with voter ID laws as a reasonable thing. If everybody had in this country, if all citizens 18 and over in this country had the same voter IDs, and they were given to us, and that same ID was able to be used in every single state in this country. But that isn't the case. What's actually the case is that states get to decide which IDs count as valid IDs. So, in the state of Arkansas, you can vote if you have a hunting license, but you cannot vote if you have a college student identification form. They say that student ID is not as trustworthy as a hunting license. That's going to have an impact on who has the right IDs in each state. So voter ID laws that are more restrictive, some require photos, some don't. Some states have a lot of different IDs that can be utilized as valid forms of ID. Some are very small in what they offer. So states that have either no voter ID laws or have a wider opportunity for voter identification forms to count are higher on the state democracy index than states that have very few voter forms of ID that can count. All right? The last concept is gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is the drawing of state legislative or U.S. House districts in such a way as to favor one political party over another. It is done by both of our major political parties today, and it is a form that is utilized particularly in more Republican states than in Democratic states. In the state of in California where you live, they don't allow gerrymandering. There is an independent redistricting commission that draws the districts so that no political party is favored over another in the drawing of the districts. States that have high gerrymandering, where one party is really drawing the districts to their advantage over another, are lower on the democracy index because it's less good for democracy than states that don't have gerrymandering going on. So states that have independent districts that draw the districts, or simply have traditions in the state that make it such that one party doesn't draw the districts in a favorable way to them over another party, are going to be higher in the democracy index. So these are 6 different subdimensions of the state democracy index. And in summary, states that have more good dimensions of this are higher on the state democracy index. States that make it easier to register to vote, states that have more voting methods, states that have more forms of election security, states that make it easier for people to get back their voting rights after felon disfranchisement, states that make it easier to vote and have more IDs that count, and states that are more likely to draw districts in a less partisan way. All of them are higher on state democracy index, on the state democracy index that Grumbach puts together. So he puts this all together and he takes all 50 states, in the country, and he looks at the states on these 6 different dimensions, and he creates a state-by-state index of the 50 states. And this is a summary graph from his work, all right, in which he looks at this democracy index on a state-by-state basis, and he tracks it over time. And so across the bottom, we see from the years 2000 to the years 2018, when he stopped his analysis. So it's an 18-year window from 2000 to 2018. And there are 3 different lines that we're going to see, and you can start to see them on the left side of the screen. The 3 lines represent 3 different state governments. The blue line are governments where the Democrats have control of both chambers of Congress, both chambers of the state legislature. So the Democrats control both chambers, like a Massachusetts, or a state of Washington, or a state of California. The red line represents the states where the Republicans control both chambers of the state legislature. So the Mississippis, the Texases, the Utahs. That's the red lines. And then there's a gray line. The gray line is where it's divided chambers, the state legislative chambers, where one party has controlled one chamber and the other party has controlled the other chamber. So he's broken the 50 states into 3 different lines over time: Republican controlled, Democratic controlled, and mixed. And he has taken these measurements of state democracy and mapped each state on a yearly basis by how small d democratic each state is. The more democratic, the more it is that citizens can participate, and the easier it is to vote, and the more likely your vote is to be treated fairly and taken care of and counted in all of this, or there's less protections for that. What I want to show you is the shift over time from 2000 to 2018. In 2000, on the far left side of the figure, the 3 lines are all bunched together. They're all bunched together. And as you go higher on the visual screen, that means you're more democratic. You offer more options for democracy. As you go lower on the screen, it means you become less democratic. You're more hostile to this kind of open democracy. So we're going to look at over time where the blue line, where the red line, and where the gray line go over the course of these 18 years. And we really see a divergence here. We see Republicans in governments that are Republican controlled in states. Remember, this is all 50 states broken into 3 different kinds of state party leadership. In states where Republicans are in control of the states, they become far less small d democratic. Okay? Made it much more difficult to register to vote, and so on and so on. In states that have become, or states that have been Democratic controlled, big D Democratic controlled, Democratic Party controlled, or states that are divided government, they are both more Democratic, small d Democratic, than they were in 2000. Both of them are. This indicates to me that if Democrats have control of at least one chamber of the state legislature, whether they have both or one, then that legislature is far more likely to drive a state towards a more democratic approach to government than if Democrats don't have any control of the state legislature. So now this is what sounds like a partisan kind of position, that I'm making some kind of partisan statement. But there's a difference between a partisan kind of opinion and a partisan factual truth, all right? It is a factual truth that in 1965, more Republicans than Democrats voted for the Voting Rights Act in 1965. That is a partisan fact. It is a partisan fact using a state democracy index that Grumbach has created, that the Democratic government, states that have a Democratic control either entirely or at least half, have become more Democratic, small d Democratic over time, and states that have become Republican controlled have become less so. This is a divergence that has occurred over time. I don't have the data past 2018. My guess would be that this pattern has not suddenly collapsed, that in fact the pattern may be even worsened. In fact, I think I might write an email to Dr. Grumbach and ask him how the pattern extends past 2018. I'd like to see that. But when you look at the claims about election denial and who should be able to vote, certainly it doesn't look like these patterns would have shifted post 2018. If anything, it would seem likely to me that they have diverged even more, that they've diverged even farther. Okay? So when we look back at those 6 dimensions of a state democracy index, we can begin to actually get some insight into how this divergence has occurred. How has this divergence occurred? And what we find out when we look at the data is that Democrats have been very focused on these 3 dimensions, making it easier to register to vote, making there more voting methods available in a state, and making it easier for people to gain back the right to vote after felony disfranchisement. Those have been points of emphasis for the Democrats as they've sought to build this certain conception of voting rights. And Republicans have had a different focus in their work. They have been focused on election security, concern, they say, about fraud that has not been shown in study after study, but claims it, and they have implemented many voter ID laws. So when we look at this divergence between the Democratic state governments and the Democratic or divided state governments and the Republican state governments, it's because the Democrats have been pursuing this agenda and the Republicans have pursued this agenda. And it has produced very different states in this country. The experiences of voting in the United States are dramatically different for states that are high in the democracy index and states that are low. They are dramatically different. In a state like Washington, which is the 2nd or 3rd highest on the state democracy index, I can get my ballot to vote 6 weeks before an election in the mail, and I can mail it back anytime in there. My signature will be checked when it's sent back, but I have 6 weeks to vote by via mail, as compared to the example I gave you from Alabama, where it's 1 day and you pretty much have to vote in person. These experiences produce very different, these laws have produced very different experiences in this country. And the Brennan Center, which is a great resource out of New York University, studied these different dimensions. And what they identified was patterns across states over the last couple decades. And these are the 2 patterns that they identified. They said, first, race is a significant factor in the patterns. Of the 11 states with the highest African American turnout in 2008 when Barack Obama was elected, 7 have new voting restrictions since 2010. That was as of 2018. Of the 12 states with the largest Hispanic growth, 2010, 9 passed laws making it harder to vote. The University of Massachusetts at Boston study that they reference here shows states with higher minority turnout were more likely to pass restrictive voting laws. And the University of California study suggests legislative support for voter ID laws was motivated by racial bias. So these shifts across time, the Brennan Center says, are motivated in a significant way by racial dimensions and concerns in the electorate. But it's not just that. They go on and say partisanship also played a key role. Of 25 states with new restrictions, 20 were passed by entirely Republican-controlled legislatures. According to a study by the University of Massachusetts at Boston, restrictions have been more likely to pass, quote, as the proportion proportion of Republicans in the legislature increased or when a Republican governor was elected, unquote. So a more diversifying state and a more Republican state, it is factually correct to say that they are states that have become less Democratic over time. Well, here's an updated statement by the Brennan Center in 2022, 4 years later. By the Brennan Center's ongoing count, Republican legislators introduced more than 400 bills in 48 states to restrict the vote in 2021 and 2022. These were not just thrown in a hopper by backbenchers hoping for a few good hours on Twitter. By October 2021, 33 bills in 19 states had become law. Many of these proposals aim to undo the practices that had successfully expanded access to vote the previous year, especially those that let citizens vote by mail or early. Others expanded purges, which removed people from voting rolls, or authorized partisans to harass citizens. The push came hardest in states with the fastest growing minority populations, states that had flipped to Democrats or were threatening to do so. And the proposed restrictions uncannily hit hardest Black, Latino, and Asian citizens. Many of these measures would have been stopped or slowed by the Voting Rights Act and its requirement that such changes be, quote, pre-cleared, unquote, by the Justice Department or a federal court. But since a 2013 Supreme Court decision had wiped out that pre-clearance rule, legislators could act with impunity to mark this divergence across time, state by state. So let's see what this looks like. I'm just going to spend a little bit of time on the data, and I'm coming in for a close here in my talk. Let's look at turnout rates across racial groups, voter turnout across racial groups. And I'm going to use data from a Brookings Institution report from May 2023. Brookings is maybe center-right in terms of its political ideology. So I'm not out here pulling in some crazy liberal entity who's just trying to make a case a certain way. We want to look at the turnout rates across a series of elections, and these are all midterm elections that they're looking at. 2006, 10, 14, 18, 2022. Every 4 years in the non-presidential election years, the midterm elections, what are the turnout rates by racial groups? And over on the right side, they're comparing 2022 to 2018. And the reason they're comparing 2022 to 2018 is because after 2018 and after 2020, Republican-led states worked even harder to pass laws to make it harder to vote, as the material I just quoted from the Brennan Center highlight. Let's look across white. This is just white right here. And look at turnout across time, and we see that it's going down actually, and then it pops back up in 2018 when there's this massive turnout in the first midterms of the Trump presidency. And there's a slight increase in the turnout percentage in 2022 for white voters, people who look like me. So when you look on the right side, the difference of 2022 minus 2018, there's an increase in turnout among white voters by 0.2 percentage point. Not a lot. But that 2018 had already been the highest turnout rate in 100 years in American midterm elections. So for that turnout to stay at that level in 2022 meant that they were able to vote. They could turn out. The laws were not targeting them. It wasn't getting more difficult for those voters to vote. They, me, could still vote. Let's compare that to these three communities of color: Black American, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. Okay? And over time, we see something different. We see a kind of up and down experience, but when you get to 2018, we see very high turnout numbers for these communities: Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans. In fact, the orange coloring shows that those are the highest across these 5 elections for those 3 groups. Black Americans at 51% turnout in 2018. Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans at 40% turnout in 2018. Not as high as anybody would like, but the highest in these 5 elections. But when you compare them to 2022, in every one of these cases, there's a decline in turnout. And the difference of 2022 to 2018 is a decline of 5 and almost 6% among African Americans, 2.5% among Latinos, and 0.1% among Asian Americans. So 2022 has an increase in turnout among one racial group and a decline among communities of color in this country. Why did that happen? Well, there's really 2 possibilities. One is communities of color were less motivated and interested to vote than white voters for some reasons, whatever reasons we might come up with. That's explanation 1. 3 communities of color were less interested to vote than white Americans. Or the second explanation is it was harder for them to vote, and so they couldn't do it. I don't have a particular way to logically arrive at the first explanation, to conclude that white voters, because of their whiteness, in some way, were more motivated to vote than these other folks. I simply don't buy it based upon skin color or race. So I'm of the mind that there must be some structural dimensions that led to this being so. And that's the work we do at Common Power, is we're seeking to flatten those structures so that all communities have the ability to vote in similar ways, and as many of them as possible to vote. We believe that our democracy is better served when more people can vote. And if Republicans would support the right to vote as much as Democrats did, then we would be in a very different place in our society today. One more piece of evidence. I want to look at 3 states across the 3 midterms of 14, 18, and 2022. 3 states, Georgia, Arizona, and Michigan. And I want to compare the 2 on the left, Georgia and Arizona, to the state of Michigan. So let's just look at Georgia to start. What we see underneath Georgia is 3 categories of voters: white, college-educated voters, white, non-college educated voters, and non-white voters in the state of Georgia. And the 3 lines are the 2014, the 2018, and the 2022 turnout rates in that state of Georgia. We see that among white college voters, turnout went up each of those elections. We see that turnout among white non-college voters went up across all 3 of those elections. And we see that among non-white voters, turnout goes up and then comes back down. Again, there's 2 possibilities to that. In Arizona, we see that among white college voters, turnout goes up across each of the elections. We see that white non-college voters do not turn out in significant numbers in 2022 as they did in 2018, but they went up quite a bit from 2014 to 18. And we see that non-white voters also go down in the state of Arizona. So white college voters are going up. Non-white college voters are mixed across Georgia and Arizona. And in both of the states, non-white voters are going down in terms of turnout. Well, it so happens that in those 2 states, it was much harder to vote for non-white voters in 2022 than it was in 2018 because of new requirements around voter signatures and voter IDs. Those requirements target people of color in more significant ways than they do white voters because of the laws in each state about which IDs count. Now, Michigan's a different story, though. Michigan expanded the right to vote over time in each of these, between 2018 and 2022. Starting in 2018, Michigan passed and adopted a couple ballot initiatives that made it easier to vote, implemented no excuse absentee voting, so you could vote for whatever reason you want by mail. And then they expanded it even further to include early voting in person. We see over time across these 3 election cycles that white non-college voters increase in turnout, the white college voters increase in terms of turnout, white non-college voters increase in terms of turnout, and non-white voters increase in terms of turnout in the state of Michigan. So now maybe there's a third option that explains non-white voters not voting as much as white voters, that somehow they were differentially motivated non-white voters across state lines. Maybe that's got some plausibility to it. But when you expand the universe and look at all of the states in the country, the same pattern that we see among Georgia and Arizona is far more likely to be found in states that made it harder to vote. And the same pattern that we see in Michigan, where it got easier to vote from 2018 to 2022, we see that non-white voters move just right the same way that white voters move. There's something about the laws in those states that have hurt the small d democracy in that state, that made it harder to vote in that state. That's the work that we do at Common Power, is to try to change that. And we work in state after state. We work in about 20 plus states around the country, working with partner organizations that are committed to making it easier to register to vote and to cast votes. We don't do this work on our own. We work with partner organizations around the United States, and we've had a lot of successes. We've made it easier for former felony disfranchised voters to vote in several states. We've expanded voting in several states. We've fought and lost against voter restrictions in Georgia and in Texas. But we're committed to this work because we believe that the most common power everybody should have in a democracy is the right to vote. It's what defines a democracy. You should have the right to vote. You should be able to do it. So I want to end here by going back to the bending of the arc of the moral universe. There are folks trying to bend the moral universe in our country today, and some are trying to bend it so that it looks like this, like the arch that we might want it to look like, where it bends toward justice. And then there are a lot of others that are attempting to bend it so that the arc is really working as it should only for certain Americans who have certain racial experience, histories, or certain educational backgrounds, or certain economic means, have certain kinds of powers. So we built an organization in Seattle that is now national in scope called Common Power. And we would be honored to have any of you come and take some of our classes and also travel with us or support our young leaders who travel. And this is what our organization looks like. Over on the far right, the organization is committed to one goal, one policy goal, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. This will be a new Voting Rights Act in the United States. It's going to update the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and it is going to implement 3 weeks of early voting for every state in the country. It's going to require no excuse absentee voting in every state in this country. It's going to require same-day voter registration in every state in this country. These are the things that we should do as a democracy if we really want people to vote. If we really wanted people to vote in this country, if we really, really wanted people to vote, we'd have polling stations on as many corners as we have gas stations. We would have it easy. You could pull up and vote easily. But we don't really want everybody to vote in this country, or at least some of us don't. And we need a federal law to make it so, because states have diverged. States have diverged. One party has gone this way and one party has gone this way. And if you leave it up to the states, then we're going to have that divergence. And millions upon millions of Americans are going to be in places where they can't register and they can't cast a vote. So if you have state divergence and you want to make it fair to all of us, what you need is a federal law. So we're here and we're working on passing a new Voting Rights Act at the federal level. To do that, you have to win the presidency, and you have to win both chambers of Congress. And then you have to pass a law. That's what we're working towards. To get there, you see 3 columns in the middle. We're an organization that's committed to education, like this lecture. We're committed to leadership development of our younger people in community with mentors. And we're committed to action. Actually going out, registering voters, and knocking on doors to get them to encourage them to vote. Those 3 things, education, leadership, and action, are what we as an organization do. And we have hundreds of volunteers from across the country who participate in this work, and we have thousands of people who participate in our education work. And we have people who financially support this work to make it possible. We're entirely funded by individual donors. There's 2 things on the far left side. These are the pathways through this work. We have basically 2 roads that take you through this work. The first, and the one in orange, is our young leaders pathway. For Gen Zers, people who are traditional college age today, they go through one pathway where they go through a summer internship that we pay them to participate in. They then get chances to be in leadership roles, to learn even more, to go out in the field and try leadership. And then they go and lead teams out in the field in our action stage. The second pathway is our institute model that I'm coming to you from today, the Institute for Common Power, that is targeted to older millennials, Gen Xers, baby boomers, and silent generation folks. Folks that are a little bit older than the Gen Zers, and they want lectures at certain times. They want the kinds of teachings and learning that we offer. They want things that are a little bit different than the younger folks. They take classes with us. They go on trips with us to learn and hear about the work for voting justice firsthand from the people doing the work. They have they come to our vision conversations. We have 2 vision conversations that are free in June. One is with Nicole Hannah-Jones, who's the author of the 1619 Project for the New York Times, and one is with Clint Smith, who's the author of How the Word is Passed, a New York Times best-selling book about the way in which racial justices and injustices are repeated in this country. And then these folks are encouraged to go out into the field and do action with these younger folks. And that's where everybody comes together in that last column, registering and mobilizing voters.
David, I'm
This
sorry.
is the work that I do.
David?
I'm wrapping up right now.
Okay.
This is the work that we do at Common Power, and we've been honored to do this for the last 5 years. And today, I'm appreciative of the opportunity to talk to you about the fight for voting justice in America. We can do something. It's on us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, David. David, if you will forward that information, we'll see that it gets printed in our in-community publications. Thanks so much for giving us so much to think about and to take action about. Thank you very much.
That's kind of you. Thank you all. Do you want to do questions, or are we all done?
Hold on. Hold on. Microphone, and for David to see you, you need to stand up and face the camera. Turn around. Face the camera. There you go.
I would like to ask in relation to initiative and referendum, this is kind of if things really get bad, do many states have initiative and referendum that they can use for dealing with situations? And I know many initiative and referendum, they only have a qualified elector as opposed to a registered voter that can sign petitions, at least, to get the process going. So is initiative and referendum still a good possibility of dealing with situations, especially in the more red states, to make changes moving toward democracy?
Yeah, great question. California, of course, does offer those. And the state of Washington does too, as well. 26 states have initiatives or referendums in them. And what is that? What are those exactly? They are ways in which citizens can get ballots, items put on ballot initiatives where you can vote directly on creating laws or repealing laws. An initiative is the creation of a law, and a referendum is a decision whether or not you want to keep it or get rid of a law. 26 states have those. They do overwhelmingly exist in more small d democratic states because it's part of the mindset of a democracy. The states that offer them, they continue to be very robust. The states that don't, that have, among the states that have offered them, there have been some that have made it harder. Florida has made it harder. The state of Ohio tried to make it harder in 2023. They failed at that. We stopped it from making it harder. The state of Mississippi has wiped out their initiative process in the last couple of years. So they used to have them and have gotten rid of them. So your question is, do those still function in ways that allow people, citizens, to enact laws or to remove laws? Yes, they do. But like other dimensions of the democracy index, they have diverged across states over time. So they're caught in that partisan vortex as well as the other dimensions of the democracy index. It is also the case that even the states that are red that have initiatives, and I'll give Idaho as an example of this, they have found ways to essentially keep the initiative, but then ignore them when the initiative produces an outcome that the party in power doesn't want to happen. Example, in the state of Idaho, they ignored a Medicaid for All initiative that passed by a large majority, and they've refused to implement it. In the state of Utah, where a redistricting initiative was passed to make it a non-gerrymandering state, they have largely ignored that. And those are both instances where the governments in power have been Republican controlled. There really are different understandings of what kind of leadership this country requires and needs between the two parties today. And that divergence is not simply about what issues to pursue and to highlight. It's really around notions of what is democracy and how should it be enacted. That's the fundamental thing that's different today about the United States in profound ways. There are really paradigmatically different understandings.
Well, David, we are very, very grateful for your wisdom, and you've given us a lot to think about. I know, for one, I'm going to go back and watch this multiple times so I can kind of wash the data into my brain and take it all in, because as we've heard so many times, just the facts, just the facts, just the facts, and you have given us the facts today, and we are very, very grateful. Thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you all for sitting through it. I appreciate it. And my understanding is you're a community that's committed to civic life. And, you know, I heard the prayers, I heard the desires there. Folks, we got to do what John Lewis says. When we pray, we got to move our feet. And at Common Power, or wherever you want to put your time, let's do something in terms of time and treasure. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.